Welcome to this video on risk management concept. This is the first of many videos in which we are going to talk about risk management. What we are going to start with is just identifying threats and vulnerabilities. There's a lot of that goes into risk management. So let's start small. Let's talk about just threats and vulnerabilities, then work our way into actual conducting an assessment. So what is risk management really? All it really is the process of identifying, assessing, and determine how to handle known risk. We do this a lot in the business, we do this a lot in our jobs, and we do this without even knowing, to be honest. So we see things, we think about them, and we figure out how to solve the problem, and that's really what we are doing here. The overall goal is to reduce risk to an acceptable level. It's also help establish things like due care, due diligence, and so on. So the overall process of risk management is used to develop and implement different strategies when it comes to information security. And the goal is to use these strategies to reduce the risk and support the mission or the business function of the organization. Now, within risk, you have two components. You have the threat and vulnerability. Threat is a potential for unwanted harm to happen, whether it be a personal or be an asset. It's the potential of unwanted harm. So vulnerability is a weakness or flaw. So this is flaw or weakness in an organizational asset that can cause harm. And yes, personal can have vulnerabilities as well. And the formula you need to know for the exam is that threats times vulnerabilities equal risk. In reality, it's threat that are coupled with vulnerabilities. If you have vulnerability and a threat to the vulnerability, you have a risk. But if you have a threat and there is no vulnerability, then there's no risk at all. And vice versa. If you have the vulnerability with no threat, there is no risk. So the formula is little bit confusing. Again, it's just a conceptual. It's not a real formula. You are not going to plug a threat and multiply all the time of vulnerability. What they are really trying to get you to think about is coupling these two things together, and that's what going to create your risk. So just to give you an example of what that look like, when you have threat against something like a web server, a malicious hacker trying to attack the web server is a threat. Malicious software that can infect that web browser is a threat. User errors are threat. Natural disaster against maybe a data center or your computer equipment room is a threat. Loss of services through loss of power or something like that, those are threats. Those are things that face that web server every single day. Now vulnerabilities on other hand are the things like unpatched system. If you have an operating system that does not have patching that's up to the current level, it could be vulnerable. No endpoint security to defend that web server from those malicious hackers or that malicious software. System configuration that allow user to commit an error, or no backup site location, which means you might lose services and now you can't restore to a backup location to continue operation. And no system resilience, meaning if one web server fails, another one can pick up and work in its place. So these are very simple example of threat and vulnerabilities. Again, just because you have a malicious hacker out, that doesn't mean that you are vulnerable, and just because your system is unpatched doesn't mean that there is a malicious hacker looking for that vulnerability. So oftentimes we get confused on this, and that's why it is so important to clearly understand the divide between threats and vulnerabilities. Now within risk management we have threat and vulnerabilities. Now what we need to understand is we need to understand the frame, the risk. So we need to understand how the organization react to the risk. So when we have a risk management strategy, we want to address how the organization plans on executing the risk management process, and also understand that not all organizations are going to be the same. Not everyone going to do the same thing. Not everyone going to have the same threats. Not everyone going to have the same vulnerabilities. So risk management is very much going to be unique, and once we framed it, now we have to access it. So this is also called risk analysis or risk assessment, where we are going to research and analyze the organizational asset to discover the potential or possible risk. Now, normally you are going to be involved in this process. However, this is a senior executive, senior management, business owner level process. They know the risk, they make the risk decision, they determine what is risky, what's not, and that's also called risk tolerance. You might also see it referred to a risk appetite, although I don't like the term very much because nobody hungry for the risk, right? It's risk tolerance is really what we are looking for. So senior management's going to drive this process and we are going to help them. Then once we have assessed that, now we have to make a risk response. So we have to decide how we are going to respond to those risks, and then once we have made the decision, sometimes that decision is not always correct, so we want to monitor that to verify that the response we made is going to be both compliant and effective according to what we want as an outcome. Now if you reference the NIST special publication 834, this is how the process is laid out. So you can see everything start with frame the middle, and then we go to assessment, then we go to response, and then we monitor, and it's a continuous flow. So what we want to do is first understand how the organization is going to react to the risk, what do we have in place to respond to this risk, how do we handle these things. Then we want to research and analyze the organizational asset to discover risk. This is where we do our risk analysis or risk assessment. Then when we respond, we are going to determine the best course of action to handle that risk, and then we are going to monitor that risk over time to make sure our risk response was effective, and remain compliant with whatever laws and regulation we are required to be compliant with. So the bottom line for this particular video is to understand the purpose of risk management, know the definition of threats, vulnerabilities and risk, and also know the risk formula, and then know the 4 components of risk management.